Hi Community of Awesome, I'm Ava J, and this is Bookish Pixie. So last week we talked about the query researching process, which means this week we're moving on to the actual query letter. For those who don't know, a query letter is a letter written by unagented writers who want to be traditionally published that generally goes to agents and editors in order to introduce them to their book and themselves in the hopes that the agent or editor will be interested in reading more. If you're looking for an agent to represent you or otherwise want to submit your manuscript to a publishing house that accepts unagented submissions, this is how you get someone to read your book. Now, query letters, while they sound relatively easy, can be really tricky. The structure of a query letter, however, is pretty straightforward. A query letter has 2 or 3 basic parts. The first and most important part is the summary of your book. Now, when I say summary, I do not mean a description of what happens from the first page to the last. That's called a synopsis, and that's a totally different monster. When you're writing a query letter, the summary you're looking for is more along the lines of a back cover copy. Now remember, a query letter should only be a page long. Therefore, your summary should only be roughly 2 to 3 paragraphs, depending on how long your paragraphs are. Important things to remember while writing your summary include: 1. Don't give away the ending. It's pretty self-explanatory, just don't do it. That's not the type of summary you're looking for in a query. Remember, your model should be a back cover copy. 2. Your protagonist. The 3 most important things your query letter needs to cover about your protagonist is A. Who is your protagonist? B. What is your protagonist's goal? And C, what is standing between your protagonist and their goal? Query point 3, what's at stake? This is huge in query letters and pitches in general. For those who don't know, the stakes basically answer what will happen if my protagonist does not achieve his or her goal. The reason this is so vital is because if there aren't any stakes in your novel, there's no reason for your story to happen. You need to make sure in your query letter that you very clearly define what will happen if your protagonist does not reach their goal. Make it important, make it big, make it matter. Once you've gotten the summary portion out of the way, it's then time to move on to the bio portion of your query letter. What you have in your bio will very much depend on you. Some credentials you might want to include are a degree that's relevant to your book, or some kind of publication, whether it's in a newspaper, a short story, or a prominent blog online, or maybe a job that isn't relevant to writing but is relevant to the topic of your book. But if you don't have any of those things and you haven't done anything related to your book or writing, that's totally okay too. In the end, the most important thing comes down to the story. Agents take clients with no credentials all the time because they wrote a really great book. Finally, the third sort of part I mentioned, which is optional, is the personalization. The important thing to remember here is that personalizations are not a requirement. I've seen agents go back and forth online over whether personalizations are actually useful, but I think the consensus seems to be if you have a genuine personalization, then go ahead and use it, but if not, don't force one. So for example, if you're querying an agent because you met them at a conference, say so. Or if you're querying an agent because you've talked to them on Twitter, you can totally say that too. Or for example, if you're querying an agent because they represent your absolute favorite author, go ahead and mention it. What you don't want to do is randomly pick a client out of an agent's list and say, I love them, if it's not true. You also don't necessarily need to say that you're querying them because they represent a certain genre. It's just not necessary. So include a personalization if you want, but don't sweat over it. Finally, as an overall note, make sure that your query letter summary is specific. Agents and editors alike read tons of queries. The thing is, after reading query after query after query, they start to sound a lot alike, especially if the authors use similar phrases, which happens more often than you might think. Phrases like loses everything, or finds himself, or goes on an adventure, or fights a dark force, or is hiding a dark secret. Those are used so often. What you want to do is make sure your query letter is so specific to your story that it couldn't be mistaken for anything else. The only way you can really do that and make sure that your query letter is clear is to get people who have not read your book to read your query letter and give you feedback. I highly recommend you do that. It's something that I found really useful when I was querying, so I definitely suggest you try that out. So that's all I got for today. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe and comment, and I'll see you guys next week.